Tonight's reading is from Romans chapter 8. We will start with verse 18, then 28, and we'll finish up with verses 37 through 39. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And in verse 28, as we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And starting in verse 37, but in all these things we overwhelmingly conquer through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord.
Is it on? Good. Okay. So this is not the lesson that I intended for this evening, this morning. Changed it this morning. I think I've put just as much thought into this lesson, but I will admit that you guys missed out. Genesis 4 is my favorite story in the entire Bible, so just blame Brian for that one, and then we'll beat him up later maybe. Go ahead and turn with me over to Genesis chapter 22. This is the lesson that essentially got me hooked on the book of Genesis, so I think this is also a good place to start. But Brian has asked me to share kind of where I've been since I've become a Christian, and then where I intend to go with the faith. And I think this lesson, it would be best done under the lessons that can be learned in Genesis chapter 22. Also, don't like being so far away. Be down here. So this is not an event, I guess, in biblical history that we are unfamiliar with, but I think it teaches us more lessons than and some of the more obvious points that are to be brought out, especially concerning the journey that we all take as servants of God, what that essentially is going to look like practically. I don't know about you, but this story, this is one of those that has made me uncomfortable ever since I became a Christian. I definitely didn't like it before I became a Christian, but it always struck me as weird, because why? Why is this here? Why would God ask Abraham this? And of course, there's a lot of shadows. There's a lot of things here that point to Jesus and ultimately what God does with His own Son. But I want to point out the fact that it paints a more realistic picture of the shadow of our life, what God requires of us, and ultimately, it paints a picture of two things. One, God shows us essentially what we need as human beings. As the Creator, He obviously knows what we need. But it also serves to show us the solution to the problem that we may not even be aware of. The fact that we need purpose. And ultimately, any purpose that isn't the service of God will never compare. But how does God show us this? So let's just take the time to read the narrative, and then we'll go from there. Chapter 22, it says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut out the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. Verse 7 continues, "And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, 'My father.' And he said, 'Here I am, my son.' He said, 'Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?' And Abraham said, 'God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son.' So they went both of them together." And so this is where I'm going to stop, because I want us to understand who Abraham is at least in this narrative, what Isaac represents, and ultimately what this paints as a picture. Some of the things I'm going to say might not make the most sense without that Genesis 4 lesson, but I'm going to try to make the most sense of it. Because in this story, it's interesting that Abraham is the opposite of Cain here, where essentially God, after he rejects Cain's original his offering, that God gives Cain an opportunity to essentially be better. Tells him if he does well, that he will be accepted. So that's an offer to return, to offer the right sacrifice to the right God. Cain rejects that offer. What we see here in Abraham's life, he plays out what that offer is supposed to look like. But what I want to submit to you this evening is that ultimately we live in a world, especially in our culture today, that is struggling with finding a purpose. That we are told all kinds of things like, do whatever makes you happy, like whatever appeals to you in the moment, that's what you should do, that's what you should take. Your happiness is your God. That's who you should serve, and whatever gives you the greatest dopamine hit, that's what you should follow. But the question is that truly satisfying? Is that what we were put here to do? And I want to tackle two concepts before I start to share how this has affected my life, which is the idea of being good and then the idea of purpose. If you remember in Matthew 7 when Jesus talks about what we refer to as the golden rule, where Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, do unto others as you like. This is how we think about it. It's very interesting that what follows that immediately in the text, I think it's verse 13 and 14, is Jesus' description of getting to heaven. We refer to it as, he describes it as the narrow road and then the wide road, the narrow gate and the wide gate. And he talks about entering into the narrow road, and there are very few who find it, and then the wide gate and the wide road and how many will enter therein. And in my original Bible, there's a verse division there. It's that title says the wide road and the narrow road. And up until this point, I never read those as one coherent idea. And I'm trying to figure out why Jesus says this right after this rule of how we ought to treat others. And I think about the picture that paints for us as Christians ultimately when it comes to our journey in service to God. And ultimately the question I want you to be thinking about as we go through this is, am I truly devoted to God? And if I was, what does that even mean? What does it mean for me to be devoted to God? And then ultimately the bigger question before you even choose to be devoted to God is, well, why? Why should I be devoted to God? And here in this struggle between what Abraham wants to do, what he thinks is right, and ultimately what God has asked him to do, right, wrong, good, and bad has completely been redefined for Abraham here. Because you got to think about what Isaac represents to Abraham. Isaac isn't just, and you got to think about how God also describes Isaac to Abraham, saying some things that are unnecessary, but necessary for us to understand how valuable Isaac really is. Because Isaac isn't just his son. Isaac is the promised son. This is probably the place in the entire Bible where the promises of God, at least for our sake reading into the text, gets the closest to just vanishing from the face of the earth. If Isaac is gone, the promise is gone. That is the one through whom God was going to bless the rest of the world. And obviously Hebrews tells us a bit more about the mind of Abraham, that Abraham was convinced that even if Isaac was dead, that God would take care of that. He trusted God. But the question is, well, how much do we trust God, right? Where what Isaac represents is not just his child, but Abraham's most valued possession, his greatest gift. Now, this may seem fairly illogical. It's like, well, the question is, well, what or who should I value? The gift or the one who gave me the gift? But, well, that's the problem that we all face. The blessings that we get from God end up being our idols, and we end up worshiping those instead of God. the things that make our life so easy and so comfortable end up replacing God himself. But what does this look like? In ancient Greek thought, that the way the ancient Greeks, like in Aristotelian thought, the way they defined good was not just good in the arbitrary sense, like your car looks really nice or your car looks good, but it was all centered around this idea of purpose. That what makes something good is how well it's able to complete its purpose. So like if you have a cup, like if your cup's broken, then it's not a good cup. It's not able to fulfill its purpose. If you're a pilot and you can't land a plane, then you're not a really good pilot. It doesn't matter how good you look in your uniform or how great that certificate is on your wall. You're terrible. You're unable to fulfill your purpose. Now the question is, what is the purpose of man? And obviously as Christians, that's summarized for us in love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind and strength. But what does that look like practically? And are we willing to live that? Go back to what Jesus says in Matthew 7. And this is the way I think at least one of the ways in which I think we ought to understand why Jesus describes the narrow way and the wide way right after that rule, which is how you treat others. Think about it practically. Which I don't think what Jesus is saying that the narrow road is so difficult to find. I don't think the difficulty is in finding it, because doing the right thing in most situations is fairly obvious. But I think why Jesus says that it's difficult is not necessarily because people can't find it per se, but it's because people find it difficult to value the narrow road. Because sometimes it's uncomfortable, truly. And it's interesting that we live, and perhaps this has been a thing that's happened for all of human history, but at least now we live in a culture where there are essentially three categories of being. Category of bad, which is easily defined, fairly obvious. Category of good, and then we've created this pseudo subcategory of not bad. So that's where we find ourselves saying things like, well, I stole this, but at least, I'm not, cheating on my wife. Or, well, my kid's kind of terrible, at least he's not doing drugs. Or, like these small justifications that we tell ourselves when we're not actively doing good, but at least, we're not criminals. Good? Okay. And what we realize is when it comes to the devotion to your purpose, and this is going to tie into the scripture reading tonight, is what does it really mean? Because one of the unfortunate things about living in this world is that we have more time than we realize sometimes, where we have the opportunity to select a terrible purpose. And unfortunately, we do have the time. Oh, that's entirely my fault. We are given enough time to actually find those purposes. So let's say that the purpose I select is I want to be incredibly wealthy. Okay, one sec. Do I need this for it to be recording? Yeah. Okay, I feel like I'm loud enough.
Stand behind the table. You take that off and stand behind. Turn that back.
Perfect. Is that okay?
Yeah, you can just.
Is it on? Good. Okay. One of the unfortunate things is that we have enough time to fulfill some of these subpar purposes. So let's say I make it my aim and my goal to be incredibly wealthy. And some of us live long enough to achieve that. We achieve incredible amount of wealth. But then there will come a time in all of our lives where almost instinctually we question, well, was it worth it? Because any purpose that you select in this life, you're going to suffer. You're going to have to sacrifice. You're going to have to make incredibly difficult choices on the journey to achieving that purpose. I think for as Christians, we have it easy because God has already told us what the greatest purpose should be, what the greatest ideal we should be serving is. That is why Paul can say things like in Romans 8, where he says in verse 18, that when that question arises, is it or was it worth it? Paul confidently says that the present sufferings of this time cannot compare to the joys of heaven. Paul is confident in the purpose that he selected, that nothing will make him let that go. And ultimately, his confidence even extends beyond the actual sufferings. But Paul says, well, even if I contribute to that suffering, so now we get down to verse 28, where Paul says that no matter what happens, God is able to make what is terrible, what is horrible. No matter what happens, God is able to turn that into something beautiful. That is the confidence that we have, not just from knowing God, but from knowing that he's a working God. That no matter what happens on this planet, he's constantly weaving all the ugly things that sin creates into something beautiful. Here Abraham is asked to sacrifice his greatest gift, his greatest possession. And I think ultimately that's a lesson for us. That if we choose to serve God, one, to be a good person. At first you have to quantify that. To be a good person, whatever purpose that you select, you have to be willing to sacrifice everything for it. That's before you even evaluate the worth of that purpose. Now, ultimately, Abraham is confident that having God as his highest purpose, that everything else can be sacrificed to it. But here's the thing. The world doesn't care about you. The world doesn't like us on a good day. Meaning the world will want to take everything from us, regardless of what we've selected as our purpose. That's one of the unfortunate things about being against God. It's that even serving the Satan, serving the adversary, you may be on his side, but he's not on your side. He's not for you. He's anti everything. Everything good he wants to destroy. Everything that's great, everything that's joyful, he wants it gone. So you being on his side does not promise you anything good. But I want you to pay attention to Abraham's response when God says, sacrifice your son, your only son. Verse 3 tells us, it doesn't tell us that Abraham went the next day. It doesn't say Abraham went the next morning. It says Abraham rose early in the next morning, and it was as if God hadn't, it was as if God told him to buy some ice cream. God said and Abraham moved. But understand that this is something, I really think it culminates in this conversation that Isaac has with his father. It says in verse 7, Isaac said to his father, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And I'm not a parent, so I don't think, I could not imagine what is going through Abraham's mind considering what God has just asked of him. And I don't know if they talked about it, if they had, a little business meeting, a little plan as to what was going on. But obviously Isaac wasn't in on the details. And here now Isaac is asking for an explanation. And Abraham has to look his son in the face. I cannot possibly imagine the amount of emotions in which Abraham is processing right now. And yet, in that moment, he finds clarity to confidently say to his son, who in his mind is as already good as dead, that God will provide. Now, is that the same confidence that we have with God when there's the possibility of us losing everything? When there's the possibility of us suffering, of us struggling? I mean, don't get me wrong, we should pray for good things and we should pray for success. But is it that our success is our God, or that we pray to the God that provides success? And we see that Abraham is blessed. But ultimately, this is the lesson that's made real by his actions. That Abraham is willing to sacrifice everything. And you think about it in the smallest ways, how that manifests in our life. That if my purpose is not sufficient, then when it does come time for me to sacrifice, when it comes time for me to actually devote myself, I won't find it worth it. So let's take something as simple as I'm standing outside, and I live in Florida, so it's hot all the time. Let's say I'm standing outside and open the door, and somebody else is walking up behind me. I mean, I'm not a bad person if I don't hold the door for them. They have arms. It's kind of hot outside. But the question is why? What reason would keep me standing out there to wait for this person, right? And it's here we can easily find ourselves slipping into the category. Well, I'm not a bad person. They can figure it out themselves. I mean, they've sure been opening doors for 20 years. But what should I do? What does my purpose require of me? And am I willing to fight for it? And ultimately, it becomes easier once you continually devote yourself to Christ. And I know that sounds like, of course, with Kayvon, duh. But like it does start in the smallest ways. And I think constantly about what Paul says in the Corinthian letter, where Paul prays that every thought be held captive to Christ, which is only a thing that can come once you truly spend time with God, right? Like if my thoughts are continual on God, of course they're going to be changed. But do I see God as worth it? Is God worth my time? Is God worth my resources? I mean, I sure was worth his when he chose to give his life for me. And what am I going to do with that? You know, it's strange to me. I find myself, well, I already admitted this morning I was a weirdo, but I find myself in situations that are perhaps weirder than me. Most of them my fault, but like they end up being weird because once I became a Christian, it's almost like, and I hope you guys understand what I'm saying. I'm not trying to be dramatic, but like there's a part of me that now can't be turned off when it comes to like the things of Christ. And obviously on my worst days, that's my conscience and it bothers me. On my best days, just like what's God doing next? I'm kind of excited to see, you know, what is he going to weave next in our life. So with this in mind, I found myself I'd really miss Gavin, and there was going to be a gospel meeting at his congregation in Southern Tennessee, and I was living in Georgia at the time, and like he texted me like, "Hey, here comes your gospel meeting." I completely forgotten. It was sometime in the afternoon. It was going to take me like, I don't know, 10, 12 hours to get there. I was like, yeah, I totally didn't forget, and I'm totally like not leaving now to get to Tennessee. So I left. It was like almost. I left. I told him I'd be there at like 11 p.m. So I'm driving, and I'm getting really tired. So now I'm in Southern Tennessee. So I'm like an hour away from his house. I'm sure Brian has told some of you this story already, so you might know where I'm going with this. But so I am speeding, and I know that I didn't know what the actual speed limit was because it was super dark. It was foggy. It was nearing midnight. I was already late. So I didn't know what the speed limit was, but I was like, you know, I'm just gonna get there. I think I was like going like 75 miles per hour. So I got off the interstate and I'm driving, and then as I'm driving down this street, get down to the bottom of the hill, and there are two state troopers just conveniently sitting here waiting to take me away. I was like, okay, well, here we go. So I drive past them, and I was like, it is what it is. And then one of them flashes lights at me, so I thought he was just like telling me to slow down. I was like, I got you. No, I was wrong. They like 2 minutes later they pulled me over, and here's the thing: I am not necessarily always known for making the wisest decisions. So in my mind, I was like, you know, it's fine. I'm going to jail. That's okay. Like I'm just gonna go call Gavin or call my mom or both and be like, I'm in jail. Take your time. I'll be here until morning or however long till you get me. Because at the time, the particular car that I was driving was not insured. Also not registered. Which, don't get me wrong, I was intending on doing it. I just hadn't yet. Also, I was speeding, so that wasn't great. And my license was it wasn't suspended, but I thought it was. Because I had gotten a ticket like 2 years before, and I'd been out of the country, and my mom said she was going to pay it. I didn't know she did. So here I am on the side of the road. It's somewhere, you know, after midnight, and the officer walks up to my car, and he says, license, registration, insurance. I'm like, sir, I'm going to be honest with you. As a young Christian man, I only have one of those things. I had my license. But I told him, I was like, I don't know if it's active or not. There's just no point in lying. So he's like, okay, would you mind stepping out of the car? I was like, of course. So he asks me, what am I doing here at this hour of the night? And I tell him I'm on my way to a gospel meeting to see a buddy of mine. He's like, where'd you come from? Because my car has Texas plates. I have a Florida driver's license, and I told him I'm living in Georgia. So he's like, yeah, this is one of those. He's going to jail. So obviously he's naturally confused, and I'm like, sometimes I talk too fast, and I'm trying to explain why I'm here, where I come from, and you know, and his partner's right there too. So there's two of them already. So I'm explaining, and I tell him like I was a Florida college student, and then I was living in Texas, and then I left my other car in Texas, and I bought this car while in Texas, and I drove down to Florida, see my family, and then I moved to Georgia. I was preaching there, and like there's a gospel meeting happening in Tennessee, and that's why I'm here. So he looks at me like, it's like like either this kid
like, he's just dumb. Like, he can't, he's not lying. There's no way he's making this up. But he's like, he's obviously not the brightest. And I was like, yeah, you got that. So he asks me if there are any drugs in the car. Which, of course, no, not of course I had drugs in the car. It's like that's a natural question to ask, this weird kid driving here in the middle of the night. And unfortunately, I thought about it, and I have a family member that is not a Christian and does some dumb things, and I couldn't remember if the last time I was in Florida I'd given him a ride. So this is what I said, because I was trying to be honest. I was like, no, but if you find anything, it's not mine. And obviously I didn't, like, I'm just like, I'm just being honest. Like, there's no point in lying. I was like, I'm already thinking I'm going to jail. But he's like, let me ask you that again. Am I going to find any drugs in the car? I was like, so I'm thinking, I'm really racking my brain. Like, I'm like, did I give this guy a ride? I was like, finally, I'm like, no. I'm like, Lord, I hope not. So he's like, okay, can I search your car? I was like, yeah, go ahead. He's like, I'm going to find anything. I was like, dude, just clothes and peanut butter. That's all in there, I promise. So he's searching the car, and then, like I'm sure they think I'm, like, the criminal at this point. Also, somebody had switched the plates on my car. There we go. That's also not great. Forgot about that one. So technically, it showed up as a stolen car, which I didn't steal it, but, Anyway, this is not looking good for me at this point. So they call backup, and, like, the head sheriff of, like, the county pulls up with, like, a trainee, gonna show him how it's done. Like, this is how you properly get these criminals. So now there's 4 of them. There's, like, 4 cop cars here, and I'm like, oh, this is just terrible. It's okay, though. It's my fault. It's okay. So he's done searching my car, and at this point, when, head sheriff guy rolls up, he asks, he's like, so I shake his hand, and he's like, how you doing? I was like, I'm doing pretty good, all things considered, possibly going to jail here. And it just, so he noticed that I drove a Toyota 4Runner. He's like, oh, you drive a 4Runner? I was like, oh, yeah. He's like, I just told him, like, I was working on it. I had to replace, like, the timing belts, and he's like, those timing belts. Apparently, he owns 3 Toyota 4Runners. So here we are bonding over the timing belts being broken in 4Runners. And then, like, so they're done searching my car, and when they're done, they walk over to me, and they're like, okay, cool, stop speeding. And, like, I didn't mean to say, like, what? That's it? And, like, you don't say that, but I was like, really? That's it? I was like, what, you wanted more? I was like, nope. No, sir, not at all. I was like, so he has my license back, which thankfully my mom did pay that ticket, so thanks, Mom. But now, I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to prison, so I look at the head sheriff guy, and like, so now they're all standing here about to go, and like, I'm like, okay, well, I'm already here. So I asked him, I was like, are you guys like busy or anything? What are you doing? And they look at each other, and they're like, what do you mean? I was like, well, I'm doing anything. Do you guys just want to talk? And like, they look at me, and they're like, what do you mean? I was like, I have time. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. It's like, and they're like, sure. So they all turn their squad cars off, and like, my trunk's already open, so I sit in the back of my 4Runner, and we're talking for like the next hour about Jesus, because I think one of them was like a Baptist, and the others, they were spiritual and all that stuff. So we're talking, and then as we're talking, I ended up inviting all of them to the gospel meeting that I was going to. But then now it's like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I have no sense of time here, and Gavin's expecting me at 11. So like, one of them, he's like, hey, isn't your friend waiting for you? And I was like, yeah, that is correct. So like, he listened to me. He's like, where are you going? And I was like, I'm going to Fayetteville. He's like, do you know how to get there? I was like, no, my phone's actually dead, so that's not great. He's like, just go straight down to the stoplight and then turn left. I was like, there's only one? I was like, I'm not used to these small towns, but apparently there's only one. And then the trainee sheriff is like, oh, we can just give him an escort. And I was like, well, that sounds like a wonderful idea. So we started this whole story with me speeding, and now here I am speeding down the highway with 2 cops in front of me and 2 behind me, and they're like, we're flying down the highway, and I'm like, this is wonderful. Okay, great. Yeah, definitely not going to jail. And as we're driving, I'm like, this is, like, I wanted to record it, but I was like, no, not doing that, not pushing it. And then, like, the head sheriff guy who's right behind me, he's like, pull over. I was like, well, it was fun while it lasted. I'm going to jail now. So he walks up to me, he's like, oh, well, we got a call to, got to go take care of something. I was like, okay, cool. I guess you can go, as if to tell the officer he's free to go. Yeah, that was the smart. I was like, that's not what I meant. Just like, he's like, son, you're good, you're fine. So I was like, okay, well, I guess I'll go find that stoplight now. And then they drive away into the night, and I'm sitting there like, I'm not in jail. This is so bizarre. Anyway, so I finally get to Gavin's house at it was like 4:30, and he's sleeping on the couch just waiting for me. And then obviously I have to tell him this story. But obviously every time he's seen me, he's wanted me to tell that story to someone because I'm just not the sharpest tool in the shed. But even still, I tell that story, one, because it's funny and I'm crazy, but because if that had happened to me 2 years prior, one, I'd definitely be in jail. But two, that would be talking to people about Jesus would be the last thing on my mind. And it's strange to me. It's not intentional. It's I told my mom, and she's freaking out. I'm like, Mom, stop worrying about they came to two of them came to the gospel meeting. That's what I care about. And it's as I said, it's not. I think the intention for continual devotion to Christ, obviously there are situations in which that is going to be more difficult when we have to make the conscious decision to sacrifice something. It's I find it easier to tell the truth now, but it's still difficult. It's I find myself hard to believe sometimes with this because I do crazy things. But I think it's supposed to get easier because of how much time we spend with God. It's right now I'm truly obsessed and addicted to the book of Genesis. And if anyone gives me 2 minutes to talk about Genesis, we're going to be talking for hours. Because one, I love that book. It's okay. I'm not gonna start ranting about Genesis now. Control myself. I say that because I have found that to be true in my life. Where I've been pulled over 7 times, and which this is the past, of course. I'm a new man, but every single one of those times, I have all of those officers' numbers, and I've either talked to them about the Lord. One of them actually became a Christian. He worships at Temple Terrace, I think. But it's I find myself remembering Jesus truly in the worst moments. It's well, couldn't get worse from here. Might as well go up, right? But it's truly in the smallest things, and it's ultimately because the concept of forgiveness is the realest thing to me. I don't understand it. I don't understand grace. But if it is true, I know that it's all I want. I became a Christian 3 years ago, and that has been the craziest 3 years of my life, concerning who the Lord has allowed me to be. Because I was wandering before, and I'm still kind of all over the place now. But it's I know I was looking for the Lord, but now I find that in His Word and in His people, that some of the kindest and most genuine people I've ever met, when I moved to Czech Republic, it's I didn't have a place to stay yet, and a buddy of mine, he was hey, I heard you're in town. I was yeah. He's where are you staying? I was I don't know, I'll figure it out. He's we have a room. I was what do you mean you have a room? Your parents don't know me. That's weird. And they're oh, he's yeah, they love you. I was they don't know me. That's weird. But it was, and they I was gonna rent a place, and they refused to let me leave. I was like a prisoner. It's fine. But the hospitality, the love that I've been shown by just random people in random parts of the world, it's just been baffling to me. And it still does confuse me because I'm you do realize I'm a complete stranger, and I'm not always doing the best things. I don't know. But it's a constant picture to me of the kind of devotion that God requires, but the fact that is rewarded. That one of the beautiful things about the pattern that God has established throughout the entire the scriptures is His desire to restore this concept of rest. That what He desires is for us to be in a continual loving relationship with Him. And even though that there is a greater picture of that rest to come in heaven, He still wants us to live as if that rest is already here. So He invites us to share that not only with Him, but with His people. One of the things I desire to do, ultimately, because like never. I've never experienced such love from human beings before, especially in the category of forgiveness. Like my family, they didn't become Christians until after I became a Christian, and like how it's changed our lives is just bizarre. Like all right, this one's not gonna take too long. I was studying Genesis. Well, this was unintentional. I couldn't sleep, so I was reading Genesis. And fast forward, I was reading Genesis 5. And then, like, I saw something. And as if like this was just a thing to do, I ran into my mom's room. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, of course. And I woke up my mom, and I was like, Mom, look at this. And she thinks, like, the house is on fire or something. She's like, what's going on? I was like, I found something in Genesis. She's like, and, like, I can see her making the conscious decision to not hate her son for waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Like, she's like, oh, okay, it's about the Bible. He's weird. I know these things. Let's just get it over with. So we kicked Dad out of the room. So now he's sleeping on the couch, and me and Mom, we're talking about Genesis 5. And then, but it's like even that process is like old Mom would have just like punched me, like, go to bed, like leave me alone. But you know, we ended up sharing this beautiful moment about like what is God telling us now about this, and that's something that I hope to share with other people. So it's like I'm not originally from the United States. I was born in the Caribbean, and I know one of the biggest hurdles that people back home face to believing is that everyone generally believes something. So it's that bridging that gap from just being a general believer to being a dedicated Christian, which is something that I say is still obviously incredibly difficult, but it's not difficult in practice, it's difficult in theory. One of the things that baffles me so much is how simple God really is. Like, we often, and I thank Brian for this example, we often expect the instructions and advice from God to be so big and so large and so mystical. Like we often have the attitude of Naaman, where it's like, oh, there are other rivers, why this dirty one? And it's like, bruh, just go. But so we too, expect God to tell us to climb the highest mountain and click our heels and clap and, I don't know, do something wild and crazy, and God asks us to love him. And how that's going to manifest in each and every situation is different, of course. But like if we're constantly concerned with what God wants, who God would want me to be, what God would want me to be, it does become easier. I have a big family. Probably bigger than the number you're thinking. I have a lot of siblings. I have at least 19 siblings. And like even in our interesting household, it's like one of the things that like when I try to talk to other people about the love of God, it's almost as if we think of the love of God as something entirely separate from the concept of love that we have now, where normal loving relationships require communication, require me to actually care about the other party that's involved in this relationship. And with God, it's like, oh, it's God, he loves us. I mean, not quite. While God's love is unconditional and unfathomable, if we want to engage in this relationship with God, it is going to require me to show up. Like show up to this conversation with God. It's also going to require me to care. Like if I want to be a better servant, if I want to survive, like that's going to require some effort. Like I had to ask myself, or somebody asked me, now I can see myself, out of all the things that I have, all the experiences that I've been through, how many times have I consciously said, this thing, I'm sacrificing it for God? I don't need this. I certainly don't want this. I'm getting rid of it for God. Like that is the reason, that's the purpose. It's a strange place to be. I don't know where honestly I'd be without that one night at Florida College, without all the things that the Lord had done to lead me to the place where I am now. Even Brian, I'm pretty sure, like he's heard like 3 stories, and they're all like the craziest stories about me. It's like, yeah, he still invited this weirdo to live in his house. It's like to me that's like it's still illogical, but it's beautiful to me, and I think that's where I'm gonna end tonight. It's like it is beautiful to me, the power of God to truly redefine our lives. that what forgiveness used to be to me is, if you hurt me, then, maybe I'll let it go, maybe I won't, but ultimately I'm going to wait till you come to me and say, hey, like, what I did was dumb, da-da-da-da, I beg you, forgive me. And they're like, okay, I guess I'm feeling forgiven today. But the way in which God asks us to operate through forgiveness is, like, I being the one that's hurt, I being the one that was abused, that was taken advantage of, I'm supposed to be the one to seek you out, to seek reconciliation, to seek restoration of that relationship. Not the way I think about things, but the way that God continues to seek us out. The way that he continues to pour out his love upon the most undeserving of people. The way that he continues to shine his light into the darkness and chaos that is our lives, and continue to show us that with him as our purpose, with him as our ideal, with us seeing him as worth living for, as he saw us as worth dying for, that our lives can be amazing. To where we can have the same confidence as Paul, to know that regardless of what we face, to know that regardless of what we have to sacrifice, what we have to set aside, that it's not worthy to be compared to the joys of heaven. That no matter how many mistakes that we make, no matter how many times we turn our back on him, no matter how many times we hurt him and hurt each other, that he is such a loving and powerful God that he can weave all those ugly moments into something beautiful, something unrecognizable. And here we have Abraham making the conscious decision that no matter what happens, I trust God. And ultimately, that love that God showed us, the love that not height or depth or angels or any created thing or anything above or anything below, that love that has given us the opportunity to be more than conquerors, to be co-rulers with Christ, to be seated in heavenly places after we were once dead and useless, after I was once dead and useless. That is the good news of redemption. That is what I wear as the helmet of salvation, that God has loved and redeemed me, and so he can love and redeem all.